Hey guys, it's Amon
And Christina
from Our Rich Journey. Today we are talking about inflation, the silent killer of financial independence for the early retiree. If you have been keeping up with inflation, and I'm sure you have been because you've probably gone out and noticed that things are a lot more expensive. And this all has to do with what is going on in the economy and the inflation rate. You see, when we achieved financial independence and retired early, it was based off of several assumptions, and one of them was the inflation rate. And so on today's video, what we want to talk about is how inflation plays into our financial independence and how anyone pursuing financial independence to retire early should combat inflation.
So just last month alone, we hit a 5% year-over-year inflation rate. So other than a 6-month period in 1991, the current rate of inflation we see right now hasn't been that high since the 1970s and early 1980s. So being aware of inflation and how to combat it and how it plays a role on your FIRE journey is so very important. So in this video, what we're going to talk about is inflation's role in calculating your FIRE number, how it impacts you once you reach FIRE, and we're also going to talk about some key things that you can do to combat inflation.
So wait a minute, we keep using the term inflation, but let's just make sure everyone is on the same page when we're using this term throughout this video. So let's define exactly what inflation is. So inflation is a decrease in the purchasing power of money reflected in a general increase in the prices of goods and services in the economy. So let's talk about inflation.
But first, if you're new to our channel is all about making money, saving money, and investing money on the road to financial independence. Amon and I pursued financial independence for 8 years. We reached our goal and we quit our jobs and retired before the age of 40. So if you are interested in learning about ways to make, save, or invest money on the road to financial independence and retiring early, make sure you subscribe to our channel and follow us on Instagram. So with that said, let's talk about inflation and how it relates to calculating your FIRE number and also how it impacts your FIRE journey in general. Now, we've talked about calculating your FIRE number a lot on this channel already, so we're not going to go into a lot of detail about it. If you really want to go into detail about it, we'll leave a video that we did on that in the description below. But briefly, in order to calculate your FIRE number, you take your expected annual expenses in retirement and you multiply that number by 25. That number is your FIRE number. This is the amount of money that you would need in a stock portfolio in order to reach financial independence and presumably never have to work again. The idea behind this calculation is that with this number, you could safely withdraw 4% from your investment portfolio and never run out of money. So the 4% rule goes into a lot of detail in this study called the Trinity study, which we have also talked about on this channel. So if you want to learn more about the Trinity study and that 4% rule, we'll leave a link for that video in the description below. But for purposes of this video, what we really want to talk about is that 4% withdrawal rate that's based off of your annual expenses. Because as we know, because of inflation, with annual expenses, if you're calculating them today, those annual expenses are going to be a lot different 20 years from now.
So what's important to note is that prices rise over time. Your money today will not have the same value that it will have in the future. And here's an example. In 1955, the average price of toilet paper was 9 cents a roll. Gasoline was 29 cents a gallon. A doctor's visit with a general practitioner was $3.41. And an adult's admission tickets to the movies was only 73 cents. Again, this was the 1950s, which marked the beginning of what could be called the modern era of inflation in the United States. So how does inflation impact your 4% withdrawal rate? Well, over the past 100 years, the stock market has had an average annual return of 10%. And since the 1950s, data tracked from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics shows that inflation has risen on average by about 3.5% per year. So, with a 10% average annual return in the stock market, along with a 4% withdrawal rate and an average 3.5% rate of inflation, Your FIRE calculation can be adjusted each year for inflation.
So in other words, with an average annual return of 10% in the stock market, your 4% withdrawal rate, including an additional 3.5% for the average inflation each year, is only 7.5%, which is under that 10% return in the stock market. So as you're calculating your FIRE number, every single year you can adjust for inflation.
And this is one of the marvelous things about investing in the stock market that we're going to get into in more detail when we talk about combating inflation. But listen to those numbers. In fact, maybe you want to replay it again, because on average, the stock market is giving you 10%. But in reality, you are only taking 7% once you take into account inflation and the 4% withdrawal rate. This leaves you, in fact, with a little bit of buffer. And we'll talk more about this, as I alluded to, but just keep these numbers in mind.
So this is really important to keep in mind that we are talking about average rates of return in the stock market and then also average annual inflation rates, which is that 3.5%. Some years there's lower inflation rates, but some years there's also much higher inflation rates. So take 1968 to 1983, where there was a huge boom in inflation. The US actually saw double-digit inflation in single years during the 70s and 80s, and the topic of inflation even became dominated in the elections. So even last month, the rate of inflation surpassed the average annual rate of 3.5%. Last month, it was 5% year over year. So what happens when you are on that FIRE journey and you see one of those really high inflation years? How do you combat that inflation? That's what we're going to talk about next.
Now we have 5 different ways to combat inflation. And the first way is by investing. And not just investing in any old thing, you have to put together a smart allocation plan for your investment portfolio. So you want to be very careful that you don't invest too heavily in asset classes that don't keep up with inflation. For example, bonds don't necessarily keep up with the rate of inflation. On the other hand, stocks tend to do that. So index funds that track the total stock market or certain sectors of the stock market tend to keep up with inflation a lot better than a bond allocation that is too heavy.
So investing is a great way to combat inflation. That's really our number one way to combat inflation. If you are interested in learning more about investing in asset allocation and how to really create a portfolio for FIRE, make sure you enroll in our stock investing course for FIRE. We'll leave a link in the description below, or you can just go to ourrichjourney.com to learn more. Our next tip is not to leave a bunch of cash in a standard savings account in a bank. And this is true even for those emergency fund accounts that you have. The idea behind emergency funds is that you want to have them in a secure place that you can have access to very quickly and easily. So a lot of times people just put them in cash or in a standard savings account, but there's other places that you can actually keep that have a higher interest rate on that money that you're storing.
And this is why it's so important that you do your research, because there are more than one place to keep an emergency fund. Inflation is eating away at any money that is in a regular savings account, because inflation is way higher than the 0.01 or 0.05% that your traditional savings account is giving you. If someone had $10,000 sitting in a bank account, they have lost 5% of that money over this past year. That's a lot of money.
So instead of a standard savings account, look for places that can give you higher returns. So for example, there are Treasury inflation protected securities, also called TIPS. They are issued and backed by the US government, and in fact, they're guaranteed by the US government to keep pace with inflation. So if you are investing with TIPS, there's a guarantee that these type of investments will keep up with the pace of inflation, which is great. But there's one thing to note. TIPS can lose value if inflation is lower than expected. So like I said, it's a great way to protect against inflation if you're investing in TIPS, but not so great if inflation is low. So there's also CDs, money market accounts, and high interest savings accounts. Now, unlike TIPS, these are not going to keep up with the rate of inflation, but in general, they are likely to give you a higher interest rate than keeping your money in a standard savings account. So the point is to really do your research. If you have an emergency fund and you're looking for a place to store it, try and find, of course, a secure place, but look for a place that offers a higher interest rate than just a standard savings account.
Our next tip is beware of shrinkflation. This is the sneaky cousin of inflation, because with shrinkflation, you are paying the same price for a product or service, but you are getting less of that product or service, so you're using it up faster. Shrinkflation is a tool that companies use to trick consumers into spending more for less of a product, and it happens very often in response to inflation. This is because most people are sensitive to price changes rather than changes in quantity. So here are some examples of shrinkflation that you probably haven't noticed because it's focused on quantity and not price. For example, Coca-Cola reduced its size of its large bottle from 2 liters to 1.75 liters, and they kept the price the same. Hefty garbage bags went from 90 bags in a 1-pack to 80 bags. The price stayed the same. General Mills family-size cereals went from 19.3 to 18.1 ounces, and in this case, you guessed it, the price stayed the same. So companies are doing this. They've been doing it for a very long time because inflation also hits their bottom line. And so how do you combat this? How do you overcome the less quantity that you're getting, but for the same price that you're paying?
So we have 2 recommendations. The first one is don't just focus on price. Like we said, many consumers, that is their main focus. You also have to be conscious about net weight and quantity when you're purchasing something. The other thing to do is to get rid of all brand loyalty. A lot of times you may see a brand engaging in that shrinkflation where they're reducing something in size but charging the same amount, and you may not see that with another similar brand. So if you start to begin to see that, get rid of that brand loyalty and go with another brand that offers the same price for a higher quantity of product.
Our next tip to combat inflation is to secure stable housing. Because with inflation, as prices rise, housing will be one of those prices that also goes up significantly. I know a lot of people are feeling the rise in prices of real estate right now.
So by owning real estate, it's a way to basically hedge against inflation. And this can be owning your own home, or if you don't have the money to purchase your own home, REITs is another way to own real estate. We have talked about REITs on this channel, so if you're interested in learning more about REITs in general, we will leave a link for those videos in the description below. Another tip for non-homeowners is to rent in areas where cities have controlled rent ordinances. Now, it might not apply to all areas in the city, but certain cities have ordinances that prevent landlords from gouging the prices of certain rentals. And if you can find rent in these areas, it will help during inflation, where landlords may want to really increase the price of your rent by a significant amount of money, but these ordinances will prevent landlords from doing that.
Our next tip as it relates to housing is be willing to move. You see, inflation doesn't hit every corner of the real estate market the same. Inflation may hit one market a little differently than another. And if you're willing and flexible to move, you may be able to combat inflation by moving away from it.
And our final tip for combating inflation is to budget. We are such huge proponents of budgeting. That's on your FIRE journey, and after you reach financial independence and retire early, you should also be budgeting. Now, when it comes to inflation, budgeting is great because it will help you identify areas in your budget where you tend to be overspending. It could be as it relates to just overspending in general, but it could also be in relation to inflation. So you can identify areas that you can cut, especially when it comes to unnecessary expenses that you are spending more and more money on each month.
And I know there are people out there that hate to budget, but I've said it before and I'll say it again. If you want to pursue financial independence, you have to budget. You have to get over your fears of budgeting or the fact that you may not like it, because inflation is such a huge factor on your journey towards FIRE. And at times of inflation, it is really important because it helps you identify where the red flags are with inflation hitting your budget. And so we've made this video to help you, but also to help ourselves because inflation affects us as early retirees, and we are constantly reminding ourselves to take a look at these areas. So we hope that you are doing exactly what we're doing during these times of inflation to combat it. And so if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and join the journey.